Okay. Now that we've worked some problems, you can see that the great majority of this lecture is working examples and hopefully can see that at least the most of the problems are problems of types that we've seen before using the perpetuity models. Okay. Again, this class is very much like a math class where the more that you work the problems, the more comfortable you're going to feel with the material. So I strongly encourage you to jump out and jump in of these lectures and use the example videos that I have to help you work through this material. Otherwise, it's going to seem like I'm sort of skipping a lot and just assuming that you know everything, because there's learning that goes on when you work the problems by hand or see them getting worked by hand, okay? So you can't just rely on these lectures. But now that we've worked a bunch of problems and we've talked about how to value common stock and the dividend growth model, what remains for us in this lecture is to talk about the features of common stock and then the features of the stock markets. Okay? And we'll talk about some history and we'll talk about some things like that. Okay? So the common stock features that are really important, these are rights granted to you by the ownership of a share of stock in a company. Okay? So this is all contractual. Okay, so when you form a company, you file a constitution. You form what's called a corporate charter. The charter lays out the rules and regulations that are going to govern the company. For instance, the size of the board of directors, which are the group of people that ultimately control the company. They hire and fire managers and control the general direction of the company. It sets out what the company is going to do, but it also sets out things like how many shares they're going to be available, what rights those shares have, and of course what that means is what rights the owners have in the company. Okay? And the most common rights, the ones that are sort of defined by law, start with the voting right of a share. Okay, so shares are typically truly democratic, and what that means is one share equals one vote, typically. So what we observe is that every shareholder is given the right to vote in the company, in any company election, and they get one vote for every share they have. So if you have 10 million shares, you get 10 million votes, and if you have 10 shares, you get 10 votes. And the elections that we're talking about are typically to elect the board of directors. Okay, so the way that shareholders generally have influence over a firm is via the board of directors. Shareholders can elect the board of directors, and then the board of directors is who has more direct power in the firm. The board of directors can hire or fire the CEO or senior management team. They can initiate, say, a merger with another firm or a sale to another firm. They can generally just manage the big direction. Then the management team, CEO, CFO, that kind of thing, they're the ones that are handling the day-to-day operations of the firm. Okay? So shareholders don't directly affect the CEO and management team. What they do is elect a board of directors who is then supposed to act in their interests. Okay? So there is usually a big annual meeting every year. That's what annual meeting means. In pre-corona times, these meetings were typically held in person. And typically, every shareholder has the right to attend. Right? But it doesn't mean it's worth it for you to attend. If I have one share of Microsoft out of 10, 20 million shares, my vote has zero power, and I'm certainly not going to spend a bunch of money to go to Seattle where they had their annual meeting. Right? But I could. They have in the past held their annual meeting in the Seattle Seahawks Stadium. They give everybody a little clicker to vote. They put up the proposals, the shareholders vote, things like that. Right? So these annual meetings are big. The one for Berkshire Hathaway, for Warren Buffett's company, is kind of like a giant party for investors. People wait in lines. People buy one share just to go, even though their votes aren't going to really make any difference. They just want to hear him talk and talk about what their investment strategy is going to be. And it's become kind of like a giant party. Okay, so there are reasons to vote, and typically what we're talking about is we are voting for the board of directors. Now, for those of us like me, I'm not going to go to Seattle to vote my one share of Microsoft, even though I may care about the outcome. What I can do is what's called give my proxy to someone. I can give my proxy, I can allow someone else to vote my share. So if I am unhappy with the direction of the firm and I think that the board of directors needs to be changed, and what I want to do is try and find a set of directors that are going to claim that they're going to shake up the firm, right? So we're going to elect 3 or 4 new directors. They're going to form a majority on the board, and they're going to fire the CEO and shake up the whole direction of the firm. We need to run this place better. And I get contacted by another group of larger investors who have more votes that say, this is what we want to do. If you agree with us, give us your proxy. They usually send you like a form letter, and you can fill it out and send it back to them, and then they get the right to vote your shares. Okay? So this is all really sort of dry and legalese almost all of the time, except in the cases where there really is some need to change leadership. Right? So in the cases where a CEO has done a really bad job, or they have committed some kind of fraud, or the company is just losing money hand over fist, things like that. That's where these powers and these votes really come into play. So in normal times, people don't care. Lots of shares go unvoted. But when things are going badly, everybody's piling in and trying to vote. Okay. Now, this power to vote is not always given freely. It's not always certainly the management team does not always appreciate the fact that they can be essentially voted out if enough shareholders get together and vote the board of directors out and change the board of directors with the instructions to change the management team. And they like it even less when the management team is the founders of the firm, the people who created the firm. They certainly feel like they should have more pull and more power, and they shouldn't be able to be forced out of their own company like what happened to Steve Jobs at Apple back in the 90s. Okay? So there has also been some concern, and this historically started with newspapers back in the early 1900s, that some companies, it would be disadvantageous to have such democratic power over. In other words, shareholders were worried, and government was worried early on, that newspapers could be bought, all the shares of a newspaper could be bought by an owner who was unscrupulous and used the news to further their own agenda and didn't act without actually reporting the news in a fair and relatively unbiased way, whatever that means, as if newspapers have ever been unbiased. But that was their concern. And so starting with the New York Times Company, they introduced something called a dual class structure for the company, where there is a voting class and a non-voting class, so that you can own shares that don't get the right to vote, or you can own shares that do get the right to vote. Or sometimes the dual class structure is structured so that one class has like 1 vote per share, but one class has 10 votes per share or 100 votes per share. So that the people who own the voting class retain the voting power. They can still retain majority voting power, even if they don't own the majority of shares. So you'll end up in the case like with the New York Times, where you could own, say, 1% of the company, but still own 50% of the votes, because that 1% of the shares that you owned had significantly more votes than all the other 99% of shares combined. And again, originally this was just sort of confined to media and newspaper companies as a way to give the founding family or the directors of the firm control, and not open up the newspaper to the potential that somebody unscrupulous would buy and just start reporting whatever they wanted. Right? This has now sort of extended into lots of different categories. The companies have been given more or less free rein to put new dual class structures in their stocks. You see it a lot with tech companies. So for instance, the Google founders still have 50% of the votes in Google, or close to it, even though they don't own anywhere near 50% of the shares in Google. They only own 2 or 3% of the shares in Google, but they own 50% of the votes. Likewise with Jeff Bezos and Amazon, and Elon Musk and Tesla, and all these sort of tech titans, they have adopted this dual class structure. But even more mundane companies do the same thing. So for instance, Berkshire Hathaway has 2 classes of stock, one with a vote and one without. And they have a really interesting setup, at least in the context of stock prices, because the Class A shares of Berkshire that have voting power, the last time I looked, which it's been a month or two, but the last time I looked, we're trading at like $250,000 a share. And the Class B shares, which are, I guess, approachable by normal people, we're still trading at like $1,200 per share, right? Which is just astronomical that you could, sell your house and only afford one share of voting stock in Berkshire Hathaway. Okay, so this is the way that small shareholders retain an outsized vote in the firm, okay? And it is getting more and more common. Now, there are other typical rights that are granted to shareholders. The biggest one is you are given the right to share proportionally in declared dividends, meaning you get a share of the profit of the firm. Again, the dividend is not the entirety of the firm's profit. It is just a proportion. But you, as a shareholder, then get your 1/10,000,000th share of that portion, right? So however many shares you own, that's how many dividends you get, and that's what your share of the profit is going to be. You get the right to share proportionally in the remaining assets during liquidation. And this is another important right, because when the shareholder is what's called the residual claimant in the firm, meaning that if the firm is ever liquidated, is ever shut down, and all the assets sold off, the owners of the firm, the shareholders, they have a claim to whatever's left after all the firm's debts have been paid. Okay, so we want to shut down the firm. We're done running it. It's time for it to go. We stop selling whatever it is we're selling. We sell all the firm's assets, trucks, machinery, computers, whatever. We take all that money. If the firm has any debts, we pay them off. Whatever money's left over is then evenly split among the remaining shareholders. Okay? So this is called the residual claim. And this is a right granted to the owners of the firm, the shareholders. Now, finally, the last thing that shareholders have is this is not the last thing. This is not an exhaustive list, but these are the most common. So the last one we're going to talk about is something called the preemptive right, or what is sometimes called the right of first refusal. And the preemptive right is the right to a new stock issue, the right to protect your proportional ownership. And what that means for us is that it allows shareholders not to be unfairly pushed out of their ownership stake by the firm selling new shares to new shareholders. Okay? So for instance, if I owned a company with just one other person, so that we each owned 50% of the company, let's say we each owned 10 shares. So 10 shares for me, 10 shares for the other person, we split the company 50-50. Right? If the company wants to raise new money and they decide to sell 10 more shares, if they sell it to a new person, then I no longer own 50% of the company. Because instead of owning 10 out of 20 shares, I now own 10 out of 30 shares. And the three of us now own 33% of the company. And that's not something I wanted. I liked owning half of my company and having half of the vote. Or maybe I owned, let's say, 51%. So I had the controlling vote, and now I no longer do. I would have to make a deal with one of the other people. So to protect that, shareholders are given what's called the preemptive right. And that means that before a company can sell those 10 new shares, they're not restricted from doing it. They are restricted from doing it to somebody new before they've offered it to me. They first have to offer me 5 of the new shares, half of their new sale, so that I can retain my proportional ownership. Okay? This is the right of first refusal. I should be the first person, the existing shareholders, get the opportunity to refuse buying new shares first. And this is exactly what happened in the Facebook case. So I don't know if you guys remember the Social Network movie about Facebook and how Mark Zuckerberg screwed out the other founder of Facebook. And half of that movie was about the lawsuit. If you didn't, it's a great movie. You should definitely go watch it, and you should watch it with these concepts in mind. But essentially what happened was Zuckerberg and this other guy had equal shares in the firm. And because he was trying to push this other guy out, he sold a bunch of other shares of Facebook to other people, to the point where instead of having like 30% of Facebook, by the time Facebook got big and by the time this other guy Saverin recognized what happened, Zuckerberg had reduced his stake from like 30% to like 0.30%. And that was a significant amount of money. It was also illegal, and that's why this guy won his lawsuit and got like $6 billion from Facebook. Okay, so this is a right granted to shareholders, and it's not a right that you can avoid.